The Wild West's Pony Express lasted just 18 months. A rider leans low over the neck of a horse that is already running flat out, and behind him the lights of St. Joseph, Missouri, are sliding away into the dark. He is maybe 19 years old. He weighs almost nothing because that was the whole job, to weigh almost nothing and to ride until the next man could take the bag from him. Over his saddle sits a square of worked leather with the mail locked inside it, and that leather is about to travel nearly 2,000 miles, across plains and desert and mountain snow. In about the time it takes a slow reader to finish a long book, this is the Pony Express. The lone horseman racing the mail across a continent. It is probably the single most famous picture the American West ever made of itself. And here is the part almost no one ever hears. The whole thing lasted only about 18 months. It lost money on every day it ran, and in the end it went broke. The greatest legend the frontier ever produced was, underneath, a business disaster and a single wire strung across the country on wooden poles put it out of work almost overnight. Before we ride with it, take 1 second, subscribe, and like the video. The true story is stranger than the legend, and we are going all the way to the moment it dies. So let us say it plainly, because the legend has buried the facts for more than 100 years. The Pony Express is one of the most recognized symbols of the Old West, and almost everything most people feel about it is shaped by paintings and movies rather than ledgers. The truth is narrow and hard. It ran for roughly 18 months, from the spring of 1860 to the autumn of 1861. It never turned a profit, not once. And it was wiped out, suddenly and completely, by a technology that was already being built while the first rider was still in the saddle. What was it? Really? It was a gamble. It was dreamed up by a freighting company called Russell, Majors, and Waddell, 3 men who already moved tons of government and military cargo across the plains by ox and wagon. Their names matter because this was their money and their reputation on the line. William Russell was the promoter, the man with the big ideas and the loud confidence. Alexander Majors was the field man who knew animals and trails. William Waddell was the careful one who watched the books. Together they bet that if they could prove a fast mail line could cross the center of the country year-round, the government would hand them an enormous federal mail contract. The kind of contract that could make all 3 of them rich. The plan was almost absurd in its scale. About 1,900 miles of route from St. Joseph's, Missouri, on the edge of the settled country all the way to Sacramento, California. The promise was delivery in about 10 days, at a time when the same letter going by stagecoach on the southern route could take the better part of a month, and a letter going by ship around South America could take many weeks more. To do it, they hired around 80 young light riders. They bought hundreds of fast horses. They built or rented well over 100 relay stations strung out across some of the emptiest land on the continent. And they invented a simple, brilliant piece of gear, a leather cover called the mochila that was thrown over the saddle and carried the mail in locked pockets and could be snatched up and dropped onto a fresh horse in seconds. It was beautiful. It was romantic. It was also doomed before it began. Because the very thing that would destroy it was, at that exact moment, already going up across the same country, one wooden pole at a time. To understand why people still talk about it, you have to understand what the ride actually demanded, because the feat itself was real even when the business behind it was hollow. The system was a relay, and the relay was everything. A rider did not gallop one horse across the desert until it dropped. That is the movie's version, and it would have killed both horse and man in a day. Instead, the route was broken into short legs. Every 10 to 15 miles sat a small relay station, often just a shack and a corral with a station keeper and a few horses. The rider would come in at a hard gallop, leap down, pull the mochila off his spent horse, throw it over the saddle of a fresh one that was already waiting, and be gone again in under 2 minutes. He would do this again and again, station after station, until after roughly 75 to 100 miles, he reached a home station, where another rider was waiting to take the mail on through the next stretch of country. The mail almost never stopped moving. The men and the horses were the parts that wore out and got replaced. The riders themselves were chosen for a strange and specific reason. They had to be small. Weld was the enemy of speed, so the company wanted young men who weighed very little, often under 125 pounds, and many of them were teenagers. There is a recruiting notice tied to the legend that supposedly asked for young, skinny, wiry fellows, expert riders willing to risk death daily, and which is said to have added that orphans were preferred. Historians argue about whether that exact wording ever really ran in a newspaper, so treat it as part of the legend rather than a confirmed document. But it captures something true about the job. It was brutal, it was dangerous, and it was built for the young and the disposable. What they earned, though, was real money. The records suggest a Pony Express rider could make something like $100 a month in an era when a working cowboy on a cattle drive earned closer to $1 a day. That is a startling gap. For a poor teenage boy on the frontier, riding the mail was one of the best-paying jobs he could imagine, and it came with exactly the kind of risk that made the pay make sense. There was also a famous condition attached. Alexander Majors, a deeply religious man, is said to have required each rider to swear an oath not to drink, not to swear, and not to fight, and he handed every one of them a small Bible. A fast horse, a loaded revolver, and a pocket Bible. That was the standard kit of the most romantic job on the frontier, and the danger was not invented for the posters. Riders crossed open plains in summer heat and mountain passes in winter snow that could bury a trail completely. They forded rivers swollen with snowmelt. They rode alone at night, through country where a single mistake meant no one would find you for days. And in 1860, much of the central route ran straight through the heart of a war. The Paiute War broke out across the Nevada country that year, and stations were burned, horses were run off, and station keepers were killed. The mail had to keep moving through all of it, and some of the most famous rides in the whole story come straight out of that violence. The name that survived best from those days is Pony Bob Haslam. During the Paiute Trouble, Haslam made a ride that became one of the central legends of the line, with stations destroyed and no relief rider available. He is said to have ridden an enormous distance, by most accounts well over 300 miles round trip across hostile country, much of it without rest, carrying a wound, simply because the mail had to get through and there was no one else to carry it. Strip away the polish and the core of the story still stands. Men did extraordinary things on that route, and some of them paid for it with their lives. And then there is the most famous name of all, the one that ties the Pony Express to the entire myth of the West. William Cody, the man the world would later know as Buffalo Bill. The popular account, repeated for generations, is that Cody rode for the Pony Express as a teenager, and that on one occasion he made a marathon ride of hundreds of miles when the next rider had been killed. It is one of the foundation stones of his legend. It is also where we have to be careful. Cody became the greatest showman of the West, a man who spent his life turning frontier history into spectacle, and many historians believe his Pony Express story was at the very least heavily embellished, and possibly invented after the fact, so we hold it the way the evidence allows. The story of Buffalo Bill the boy rider is part of how the legend was built. Whether it happened the way he told it is a different and much shakier question. Here is the thing to hold on to, though, before we go any further. Every bit of this, the relays, the speed, the courage, the famous rides, was genuinely impressive, and none of it, not 1 mile of it, ever made financial sense. Because while the riders were becoming legends, the company was quietly bleeding to death. Start with what it cost to build the thing. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had to create an entire transportation network across 1,900 miles of mostly empty country. And they had to do it fast. That meant buying hundreds of high-quality horses, the fast kind, which were not cheap. It meant building or leasing well over 100 stations and stocking each one with feed, equipment, and men who had to be paid and supplied in places where everything had to be hauled in by wagon. It meant the riders themselves on those high wages. The fixed cost of simply existing before a single letter moved was enormous. Now set that against what they could charge. At the start, sending a letter by Pony Express cost $5 for every half ounce. Think about what that meant in 1860. $5 was more than many laborers earned in a week. It was a price only banks, newspapers, businesses, and the wealthy could really justify, and only for messages where speed was worth almost anything. So the volume of mail was always limited. There simply were not enough people willing to pay a small fortune to shave weeks off a letter. Later, the company cut the price, eventually down to about $1 per half ounce, trying to bring in more business, but cutting the price did not fix the problem. It just meant losing money on more letters instead of fewer. The math never closed. By most estimates, the Pony Express took in only a fraction of what it cost to run, and lost something on the order of $200,000 over its short life. The amounts riding on each individual letter could not begin to cover the cost of the horses. The stations, the feed, the wages, and the constant losses from weather and raids. Every romantic ride you have ever pictured was, on the company ledger, another entry in red ink. So why keep doing it? Why pour money into something that lost money every day? Because the Pony Express was never really meant to earn its keep by carrying mail. It was a loss leader, in the oldest sense of that phrase. It was a demonstration. Russell, Majors, and Waddell were trying to prove a single point to the government in Washington, that the central route across the country could carry fast, reliable mail all year, even through winter, even through war. If they could prove that, they expected to win the big federal mail contract that was up for grabs. A contract worth far more than the Pony Express could ever lose. The whole bleeding enterprise was a bet that a future government check would more than pay for the present losses. And the gamble was not crazy on paper. The country was sliding towards civil war, and the southern mail route was about to become politically impossible. The central route, the Pony Express route, was suddenly the obvious choice for a nation about to split. The founders could see the prize. They just could not survive long enough to collect it on the terms they needed. Behind the romance, the company was already coming apart for reasons that had nothing to do with horses. William Russell, the promoter, got tangled in a financial scandal involving government bonds back east, an ugly affair that wrecked his credit and the firm's reputation at the worst possible moment. The losses from the Paiute War had been savage. The whole house of cards that was Russell, Majors, and Waddell was swaying long before the end. A perfect run, a record ride, the fastest mail anyone had ever seen. None of it could fix the underlying arithmetic. And then, before the math could even finish killing the company, something else arrived that made the entire question pointless. While the riders were racing across the plains, crews of men were moving across the same country far more slowly and far more quietly, and they were carrying the future on their shoulders. They were building the transcontinental telegraph. Pole by pole, mile by mile, two crews were stringing a single iron wire across the continent, one working west from the settled east, one working east from California, both aiming to meet somewhere in the middle. They followed roughly the same central corridor the Pony Express rode, and every mile of wire they finished was a mile the horse no longer needed to carry. For a while, the two coexisted in a strange relay of their own. As the wire crept inland from each coast, the Pony Express carried messages across the shrinking gap in the middle that the telegraph had not yet closed. The rider became the living patch over the missing piece of the line. You can almost see it. The fastest horse on the frontier reduced to a stopgap, sprinting across the last unwired stretch, while behind him, the thing that would replace him got closer every single day. On October 24, 1861, the two ends of the line met in Salt Lake City, and the wire was complete. For the first time in history, a message could cross the entire country in a matter of minutes, not 10 days. Not 7 days and 17 hours, which was the Pony Express's own legendary record, set carrying President Lincoln's inaugural address west in the spring of that year. Minutes. A few taps of a key in one city, and the words appeared almost in the same breath on the far side of a continent. Against that, the lone rider on the fastest horse in the West was not slow. He was finished. There was simply no contest, and there was no clever answer to it. You cannot outgallop electricity. The thing that beat the Pony Express had no horse, no rider, no courage, and no need for any of it. It was a current moving down a wire. 2 days after the line was completed, the Pony Express officially announced that it would shut down, and within a few weeks the last riders made their final runs, and the service ended for good. The most famous fast mail line in American history had been rendered completely obsolete in a single afternoon by an invention that had been visibly approaching for over a year. Russell, Majors, and Waddell, already crippled by debt and scandal, collapsed into bankruptcy. The founders who had bet everything on proving the central route never got to enjoy the prize they had spent themselves to win. The horses were sold off, the stations emptied out, and the leather mochila, that clever little bag that had crossed the continent again and again, became a relic almost the moment the wire went live. So now put the whole thing back together, and look at what is actually there. The Pony Express ran for about 18 months. It lost money on every one of those days. It was built by 3 men who went broke building it, to win a contract they did not survive to collect, and it was destroyed almost instantly by a technology that was being assembled in plain sight the entire time it operated. By every measure a business is supposed to be judged by, it was a failure. It is, in cold terms, one of the great commercial disasters of the American frontier. and it became immortal anyway. That is the strange thing the ledgers can never explain. The wire won. The telegraph carried the country's words for the next half-century, while the Pony Express was already a memory. But almost no one tells stories about a telegraph operator tapping a key in a warm office. They tell stories about a teenage boy on a fast horse, alone in the dark, racing weather and distance and danger with the mail strapped under him, refusing to stop. The thing that failed financially captured something the thing that won never could. It gave the West its purest image of speed, courage, and the lone human being thrown against an enormous and indifferent country. The Pony Express went broke selling the one thing it was best at, and it bought, without ever meaning to, something no wire could carry. It traded every dollar it had for a legend, and the legend outlived the business by more than 100 years and is still running. The fastest horse on the frontier lost the race to a wire, and somehow it is the horse we still remember.